He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply reached up, pressed the call button one more time, and waited for the woman who had spent the last hour pretending he was invisible. When she finally came, he said 6 quiet words that would end 3 careers by morning. "Get me the captain, please. Now." 34,000 feet over the Atlantic, in a cabin of warm light and cold smiles, the man in the worn grey jacket held his sleeping daughter a little closer, and the airline that had just humiliated him began to come apart, seat by seat, from the inside. He wasn't angry. That was the frightening part. Anger would have been easy to dismiss. This was something quieter and much harder to survive. 3 hours earlier, not one person on Flight 88 knew his name. That was exactly how he wanted it. To understand how a single phone call brought a cabin of arrogant people to silence, you have to go back to the morning it began, and to who this tired man in the cheap jacket actually was. His name was Daniel Cross, and to the crew boarding that morning, he was nobody worth remembering. A man in his early 40s, in a soft grey Henley, and a jacket gone thin at the elbows, holding the hand of a small girl, with fever-pink cheeks, and a well-loved grey stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. What the crew didn't know, what almost no one who met him ever knew, was that the name printed on every safety card in that cabin, stitched into the carpet of the jet bridge, painted on the tail of the aircraft above them, and signed at the bottom of all 11 of their paychecks, belonged to him. Daniel had built Altair Airways from a single leased turboprop and 11 years of not sleeping. He'd started it in a rented hangar with 2 mechanics and a dream most people laughed at. Now it flew to 40 cities. He owned it outright, no board, no investors he had to please, just him and a company he loved the way other men loved their childhood homes. And almost no one knew his face. That was on purpose. Daniel flew coach, unannounced, 4 or 5 times a month. He'd sit in the back in an old jacket and watch how his people treated the person they assumed had no power. He believed you learned nothing about a company from the boardroom. You learned everything from how it treated the passenger in 34E, who'd never fly first class in his life. His crews had a quiet legend about it. The boss could be on any flight, but legends fade, and new hires stop believing them. He hadn't planned to fly first class that day. He almost never did. But that morning his daughter Emma was sick. Nothing serious. A low fever, the kind that makes a 7-year-old miserable and clingy. But they'd booked this trip months ago, to see Emma's grandmother, and the pediatrician had said she was fine to fly as long as she could rest. So Daniel had done the one thing his own frugal habits usually wouldn't let him. He bought 2 seats in first class, window and aisle, room for a little girl to stretch out and sleep. He did it for her. He always did everything for her. "Daddy, my head's hot," Emma murmured as they walked, leaning her weight into his leg. "I know, Bug." He crouched, pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, and smoothed her hair. "You close your eyes on the plane. We'll be at Grandma's before you even wake up. I promise." She nodded, satisfied by the promise the way children are, and reached up for his hand again. He'd lost her mother 2 years ago, Sarah, a long illness, a slow goodbye that had hollowed him out and rebuilt him into someone smaller and gentler. Since then, it had been the 2 of them against the whole wide sky. He'd have burned the airline to the ground before he let anything hurt this child. He didn't know it yet, but that promise was about to be tested at 34,000 feet. The senior flight attendant working the front cabin had a name tag that read Bianca. She had a bright, practiced smile, the kind that switches on for the right passenger and switches off the instant it isn't needed. She was good at reading people, or believed she was, and when Daniel Cross stepped through the cabin door with his tired eyes and his fraying jacket and a child clutching a stuffed rabbit, Bianca read him in half a second and decided she already knew everything about him. She looked at the jacket, she looked at the rabbit, she looked at his boarding pass, and something in her face closed like a door. "Sir?" Her tone was patient in the way that isn't patient at all. "Are you quite sure you're in the right cabin?" "Economy boards through the second door. Seats 2A and 2B, Daniel said quietly, showing the passes again. Bianca's eyes flicked over them. "These seats are quite expensive," she said. She said the word expensive the way some people say dirty, as if the price tag itself were a fact about him. "I'm aware," Daniel said. "Thank you." He didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that arguing with a person like this only feeds them. He took Emma to row 2, helped her into the window seat, buckled her in, and tucked his worn jacket over her small body like a blanket. She was already half asleep, her cheek warm against the leather, the rabbit pressed to her chin. Bianca watched the jacket go over the child, and her mouth tightened, as if a man like that draping a cheap coat over a first-class seat was a small personal insult. She turned to the other attendant in the galley, a man named Marcus, the cabin's second most senior, a decade in and long past caring. "Keep an eye on 2, she murmured. "I don't think they belong up here." Marcus glanced down the aisle, shrugged, and said nothing. Saying nothing was Marcus's whole strategy for a peaceful career. It would turn out to be the most expensive decision he ever made. From that moment, Bianca made Flight 88 a small, cold war, and she assumed, as people like her always do, that she was the one holding all the power. The welcome service started before takeoff. Champagne appeared for the businessman in 1A. A warm towel, unfolded with a flourish, for the elegant older woman in 3C. A passenger named Eleanor, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, watching the cabin over the top of her reading glasses with the quiet attention of someone who has seen a great deal of life. Sparkling water for the couple in row 4. Daniel raised a hand, politely. "Could my daughter have a cup of water, please? She's running a little fever." "Of course," Bianca said, with a smile that didn't reach anything, and walked past him to refill 1A's champagne. The water didn't come. He waited 10 minutes and asked Marcus instead, when the man passed with a tray. "Just water, whenever you get a chance. For my little girl." "I'll pass it along," Marcus said, and passed it along to no one. By the time they reached cruising altitude, Daniel had asked 3 times, of 2 different crew members, for a single cup of water for a sick child. 3 times, nothing had come. Not a refusal exactly. Refusals can be argued with. Just a smooth, smiling nothing, a wall of politeness with no door in it. Emma stirred, her lips dry. "Daddy, I'm thirsty." "I know, Bug. It's coming. Hang on." He pressed the call button. Bianca appeared, and before he could speak, she said, in a lowered, confidential voice, as if letting him in on a rule, "Sir, we're very busy in the front cabin right now. There's a service flow." She gestured vaguely at the champagne and the warm towels, the busy work of pampering people she'd decided were worth pampering. "I'll get to it." Then she walked away to hand Eleanor a menu Eleanor hadn't asked for. Daniel sat with his thirsty, feverish daughter and said nothing. He watched. He was very good at watching. It was a young attendant who broke the pattern. Her name tag read Grace, and she was new. You could tell from the way her hands still trembled slightly with the heavy coffee pot, from the too careful way she recited the meal options. She'd seen the whole thing from the galley. She'd heard a man ask 3 times for water for a sick child, and she'd watched 2 senior colleagues decide he didn't matter. When Bianca disappeared into the forward galley, Grace crossed the cabin quickly, knelt down beside Emma's seat so she was at the child's level, and pressed a cool bottle of water and a small packet of crackers into Daniel's hands. "For your little girl," she whispered. Her eyes were kind and a little frightened. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm really sorry." "Thank you," Daniel said softly. He looked at her name tag and then at her face, and something in him, the part that had built an entire company on the idea that this exact moment matters more than any boardroom, quietly filed it away. "Thank you, Grace." She gave Emma a small smile, and then she was gone, back to the galley, before anyone could see what she'd done. Daniel didn't forget that. Daniel never forgot the kind ones. It was, in a way, the whole reason he'd built the thing he'd built. An hour into the flight, Emma's fever climbed. She woke fully now, flushed and unhappy, and started to cry. Not a tantrum, but the soft, exhausted, bewildered crying of a small child who feels terrible and doesn't understand why, and just wants to be held. "Shh, shh, I've got you." Daniel unbuckled her, lifted her against his chest, and stood in the aisle where he could rock her gently without kicking the seat in front. He began to hum, low, tuneless, the melody Sarah used to hum when Emma was a baby who wouldn't sleep. It was the only lullaby he knew. It had always worked. It half worked now. Bianca watched from the galley curtain, and her expression curdled. She came down the aisle. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down and keep your child quiet. The other passengers in this cabin paid a great deal of money for a peaceful flight." "She's 7, and she's sick," Daniel said, keeping his voice even. "I'm calming her the only way I can. As soon as she settles, we'll sit." "That's not really my problem," Bianca said. From across the aisle, the older woman, Eleanor, lowered her reading glasses. "For heaven's sake," she said, not loudly, but clearly. "The man is soothing a sick little girl. Some of us find that far less disturbing than watching you hound him about it." Bianca's smile flickered. She wasn't used to passengers taking the wrong side. She recovered, turned back to Daniel, and lowered her voice to something private and hard. "Perhaps," she said, "you'd both be more comfortable in the back of the aircraft. In economy. With people like you." The words landed in the cabin like a dropped glass. People like you. Emma, who understood far more than adults ever gave her credit for, lifted her hot little face from her father's shoulder and looked at Bianca, and then up at her dad. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is the lady mad at us? Did we do something wrong?" And there it was, the one question that could still cut Daniel Cross to the bone. Not the insult to him. He didn't care about that. It was this, that his sick daughter, on a plane he owned, was learning that she and her father were the kind of people who got sent to the back. Something in his chest went very still and very cold, but he only kissed the top of Emma's head and murmured, "No, Bug. We didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing." Marcus stood in the galley doorway, watching, saying nothing, the way he always said nothing. Daniel looked at Bianca for a long moment. He was not a man who made scenes. 11 years of building something out of nothing had taught him that the loudest person in any room is almost never the most powerful one, and that power used loudly is usually power about to be lost. "You want to move us to economy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's best for everyone," Bianca said, and the confidence was fully back in her voice now, because she thought she'd won. "All right," said Daniel Cross. He didn't make her repeat it. He didn't demand a manager. He simply gathered his sleeping daughter, her rabbit, and his thin jacket, and, in front of a first-class cabin that had gone completely silent, he carried his child to the back of his own airplane. The walk was long. It's always long, that walk. Past the curtain, past the galley where Marcus wouldn't meet his eyes, down the narrow aisle of the main cabin, all the way to the very last row, to a cramped middle seat wedged beside the humming lavatories, where the air was stale and the engine noise was loudest. He sat down. He arranged Emma across his lap as best he could in the small space. He held her, and he hummed Sarah's tuneless lullaby, and after a while, mercifully, the fever and the crying and the motion of the plane pulled her down into sleep. A young man across the aisle in economy had watched the whole procession. "Rough flight, man," he said sympathetically. "First class kick you out?" "Something like that," Daniel said, and almost smiled. He sat there for a moment in the roar of the back of the plane, his daughter's warm weight against him, the grey rabbit fallen against his arm. He thought about Sarah, who had been a flight attendant on his very first route, 100 years ago, before any of this, who had taught him that the whole job, the entire reason planes were worth flying at all, was to take care of the person in front of you, especially the one who couldn't do anything for you in return. She would have knelt down like Grace. She would have brought the water without being asked. He thought about Emma's question, "Did we do something wrong?" And then Daniel Cross, owner of Altair Airways, sitting in the last row of his own aircraft, in a jacket worn thin at the elbows, reached up into the raw and the stale air and pressed the call button. The soft chime sounded in the aft galley. A flight attendant Daniel didn't recognize came back, saw a tired man in a cheap jacket in the last row, and clearly assumed this would be about a blanket or a snack. "Yes, sir? I'd like to speak with the captain, please," Daniel said. "Not the purser. The captain. Tell him it concerns the operation of this flight. Tell him the passenger's name is Cross. Daniel Cross." The attendant blinked. It was an odd request, delivered too calmly to ignore. "I'll let the flight deck know, sir." "Sir?" Up front, the message reached the cockpit. Captain Ray Hollis had flown for Altair Airways for 9 years. He was a steady, unshowy man 3 years from retirement, and he knew 2 things about the company he'd given most of his career to. First, that it treated its people fairly, more fairly than any airline he'd flown for before. And second, an old piece of crewroom folklore that most of the younger staff had stopped believing, that the man who owned the airline was known to fly unannounced among his own passengers, in coach, in an old coat, watching. Hollis had never met Daniel Cross, but he'd seen the name on a company-wide letter every Christmas for 9 years. And when the aft crew relayed that a passenger named Daniel Cross was asking for the captain by name, from the last row of the aircraft, something cold walked up the back of Ray Hollis's neck. He handed control to his first officer, unbuckled, and walked back through the airplane himself. He passed through first class. He passed Bianca, who straightened and produced her brightest smile for the captain. He kept walking. He walked the entire length of the main cabin, all the way to the back, to the cramped middle seat by the lavatories, and when he saw the tired man in the worn jacket holding a sleeping child, and matched the calm grey eyes to a face he'd only ever seen in a photograph on a company newsletter, Ray Hollis felt his stomach drop straight through the floor of the aircraft. "Mr. Cross," he said, quietly, carefully. He straightened, almost to attention. "Sir, why on earth are you sitting back here?" His voice, in the sudden lull of the cabin, carried, heads turned in economy. And up in first class, where the curtain had been left open, Bianca heard the captain's tone, the deference in it, the alarm, and she heard the name, and the practiced smile began, very slowly, to slide off her face. "Because," Daniel said, rising carefully with Emma still asleep against his shoulder, "I was told, 3 hours ago, that people like me belong in the back. So that's where I went. I wanted to see how far it would go." He carried his daughter forward. Hollis walked beside him, half a step behind, the way you walk beside someone whose authority you've only just remembered. The whole aircraft watched a man in a cheap jacket walk up the aisle, like the aisle belonged to him. Because it did. He stopped at the front of the cabin, in the galley where Bianca and Marcus stood frozen, and turned so the first-class passengers could see him. And when he spoke, his voice was level and quiet and absolutely certain, which was somehow far more terrible than any shouting could ever have been. "For those who don't know me," he said, "my name is Daniel Cross. I own this airline. I own this aircraft, and I have flown in the back of it, in a coat like this one, more times than any of you would believe, because the only way to know what a company truly is to be treated by it as if you're no one at all." He let that settle into the silence. "Today," he said, "I found out exactly what this cabin is." He turned first to Captain Hollis. "Captain, I have no complaint about you, or the flight deck. You've flown this aircraft perfectly, and you came the length of it the moment your name was called. Thank you." "Sir," Hollis said, and nothing more, because there was nothing to add. Daniel turned to face Bianca. She had gone the color of paper. "For 3 hours," Daniel said, "I asked this crew, politely, for 1 cup of water for a sick 7-year-old. I asked 3 times. I received a great deal of smiling and no water." He shifted Emma gently against his shoulder. "When my daughter cried because she felt awful, I was told she was disturbing the cabin. When I calmed her the only way I could, I was told that she and I would be more comfortable in the back, with people like us." The businessman in 1A, who had accepted 3 glasses of champagne while a child went without water, was now staring intently at his own hands. "Do you understand what I kept thinking about?" Daniel said, and for the first time something raw moved under the calm, while I sat in the last row of my own airplane. "Not the insult. I've been insulted before. It costs me nothing. I kept thinking about a question my daughter asked me. She asked me if we'd done something wrong. She's 7, and on a plane I built with my own hands, she was being taught that she and her dad are the kind of people who get sent to the back." He stopped. The cabin didn't breathe. "That," he said, "is the one thing I cannot forgive. Not because it happened to me, because it happens, and I have to find out whether it's who we are." Here is where a smaller man would have done the satisfying thing, fired her on the spot, screamed, made her cry in front of everyone, and called it justice. Daniel Cross did something harder and much heavier. "Captain Hollis," he said, turning away from Bianca, "when we land, I want a full report filed with operations. The complete service log for this flight, the cabin camera footage from pushback to landing, every request made by every passenger, and precisely how it was answered. Not opinions, not my word against anyone's. The record. All of it. Yes, sir. I'll see to it personally. Only then did Daniel look back at Bianca. She had begun, very quietly, to cry. "You're not being suspended because you embarrassed me," he told her. And his voice was not cruel. That was the strange part. It was almost gentle, and it was worse for it. "I genuinely don't matter here. You're suspended, pending that review, because a member of this crew refused water to a sick child and told a paying family they belonged in the back. And I have an obligation to every person who flies with us to find out whether that was one bad day or a pattern." He paused. "I hope, for your sake, the record is kind to you. I hope it shows me a good employee having the worst shift of her life. If it does, we'll talk about how you come back from this. But if it shows a pattern, if this is simply who you are when you think no one important is watching, then you can't work here, because that's not the airline my wife and I built." His voice caught, almost imperceptibly, on my wife. "The record will decide that, not my temper. That's the only fair way to do this." It was not mercy exactly. It was something rarer. A powerful man, holding every card, refusing to punish from anger, and insisting on the truth instead. Somehow it filled the cabin more completely than any rage could have. Then he turned to Marcus, who had spent the entire flight in the galley doorway, watching, saying nothing. "You saw all of it," Daniel said. "Not a question." Marcus's mouth worked. "It wasn't my table, sir. I didn't want to overstep." "You're right that it wasn't your table," Daniel said. "But it was your cabin, and your airline, and a sick child asked for water in front of you, and you decided that keeping your head down was easier than doing something about it. That's also going in the report. Not because I want to end your career, but because you should know, for the rest of it, that there is no such thing as neutral when you watch something like this happen and choose to say nothing. Silence is a choice. Today you made it. I hope you remember how it felt." Marcus looked at the floor and said, for the first time all day, something true. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I should have brought the water." "Yes," Daniel said, not unkindly. "You should have." And then at last, Daniel Cross turned toward the young attendant, standing white-knuckled by the forward galley, and his whole face changed. The cold went out of it. What was left was something warm and almost broken. "Grace," she startled at her own name. Yes, sir. You knelt down next to my daughter when you thought no one important was watching. You brought her water and crackers, and you told her you were sorry it took so long. You had no idea who I was. You didn't do it for me. You did it because there was a sick child and a tired father in front of you, and something in you couldn't walk past that." He nodded slowly. "That's the whole job, Grace. That is the entire reason any of these planes are worth flying. Everything else is just serving champagne." Grace's hand rose to her mouth. Her eyes filled. "When we land," Daniel went on, "I'd like operations to arrange a meeting with you about a promotion and a raise, effective today. This airline needs a great deal more of exactly what you did in row 2, and a great deal less of everything else that happened up here." He glanced, once, at the champagne glass in 1A. "We'll be talking about training too, for everyone." For a moment no one moved. Then, from seat 3C, the older woman, Eleanor, began quietly to applaud. After a beat, the couple in row 4 joined her. Then, shamefaced, the man in 1A. The sound filled the cabin, and it was not for the reveal, and it was not for the power. It was for the water, and the kneeling, and the man who'd chosen fairness when he could have chosen fire. Daniel didn't acknowledge the applause. He simply looked down at his daughter, still asleep through all of it, and carried her to seat 2A, and sat down, and drew his thin grey jacket back over her like a blanket. They landed just after noon, into clean, bright sunlight. Emma woke as the wheels kissed the runway, blinking up at her father, her fever a little lower now, her cheek creased from sleeping against his shoulder. "Are we at Grandma's?" she asked. "Almost, Bug." He smoothed her hair. "Almost. She's waiting right inside." As the aircraft taxied, Captain Hollis's voice came over the cabin address, the usual thanks, the local time, the weather, and then, after a small pause, something not quite usual. "On behalf of all of us at Altair Airways, thank you for flying with us today. Every single one of you. We'll always try to earn it." In the first-class cabin, no one quite met anyone else's eyes. Bianca left the aircraft first, before the doors were even fully clear, pale and silent, her bright smile nowhere to be found. She would spend the taxi and the jet bridge and the long drive home replaying a single flight, and a single choice, and a question a 7-year-old had asked in a quiet cabin. Grace stood at the forward door as the passengers filed off, and when Daniel and Emma reached her, she crouched down to Emma's height. "Bye," she said. "Feel better, okay? Drink lots of water." Emma, shy, held up the grey rabbit so the rabbit could say goodbye too. Grace shook the rabbit's paw very seriously. Daniel watched, and for the first time in 3 hours, he smiled with his whole face. "Thank you, Grace," he said. "I meant every word. Someone will call you today." And then Daniel Cross carried his daughter up the jet bridge and out into the sunlight, one arm around her, her head on his shoulder, the worn grey rabbit dangling from his hand. Just a tired dad and his little girl, walking toward a grandmother waiting at the window. Exactly what he'd looked like when he walked on. Exactly who he'd been the whole time. The review took 3 weeks. The record, as records do, told the truth. It showed a long pattern, not one bad day, but many. Bianca's time at Altair came to a quiet, documented end. Not because a powerful man had been angry in a cabin at 34,000 feet, but because the truth mattered more than the man, and the airline was worth more than any single moment of revenge. Marcus kept his job, and, those who flew with him said, became, rather suddenly, the kind of steward who noticed the passenger no one else did. Grace was flying the front cabin, as a lead attendant, before the end of the year. She kept a small grey rabbit keychain clipped to her flight bag, and never told most people why. And somewhere over some ocean, a few times a month, a tired man in a worn jacket still buys a seat in the back of his own airplane, and watches, and quietly notices who kneels down and who walks past. People had spent an entire flight deciding who Daniel Cross was, based on a jacket. In the end, they would remember him not for the moment he revealed what he owned, but for what he chose to do with it. Not the power, the restraint, the fairness, the refusal to become, even for one satisfying minute, as small as the people who'd wronged him. He never did raise his voice. He never had to.